The dust danced in the sliver of afternoon light cutting through the grimy window of Julian's small apartment. It was a lazy, pointless dance, much like he felt his own life had become. He sat on the edge of his worn-out couch, staring at his right hand. It lay open on his knee, a traitor. The fingers, long and elegant, still looked like the hands of a pianist, but they no longer obeyed his commands. They curled, sometimes slightly, sometimes into a tight, painful fist, a condition the doctors called focal dystonia. To Julian, it felt like a curse. It was his own body staging a rebellion against the one thing that had ever given him a voice. His apartment was a museum of a life that wasn't his anymore. In one corner, a sleek, black grand piano sat under a white sheet, looking like a forgotten ghost at a feast. He hadn't lifted the sheet in months. Why torture himself? The memory of the music was sweeter and less painful than the reality of the broken notes his hand now produced. Stacked on the piano were yellowing envelopes, final notices from the bank, and past-due rent bills. On the floor beside them, leaning against the wall, were towers of sheet music. Chopin, Rachmaninoff, Liszt, the names were like old friends he could no longer visit. He could still read the notes, still hear the music perfectly in his head, a full orchestra playing just for him. But the bridge between his mind and his fingers was a collapsed ruin, just yesterday. He had given a lesson to a 10-year-old boy whose parents had more money than sense. The boy had banged on the keys of his cheap keyboard, his eyes glued to a tablet propped up on the music stand, his fingers mashing the keys in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the simple melody Julian was trying to teach him. "Can we just play the song from the game?" The boy had whined for the 10th time. Julian had felt a cold knot of anger and despair tighten in his stomach. He, who had once commanded the stage of Carnegie Hall with a flick of his wrist, was now a musical babysitter for a child who saw the piano as just another noisy toy. He had collected his meager fee at the door, forcing a smile that felt like cracking glass, and walked home with the $40 clutched in his hand, feeling like an insult. He was just about to get up and make another cup of instant coffee, the bitter kind that tasted like disappointment, when a sharp, clean knock echoed from his door. It wasn't the usual timid rap of the mailman or the heavy thud of his landlord. It was a precise, confident knock. Julian frowned, pulling himself off the couch. He wasn't expecting anyone. He never expected anyone anymore. He opened the door to find a man standing in the hallway, so perfectly still he looked like a statue. He wore a crisp, black suit and a black chauffeur's cap, and his face was completely blank. He held out a single, cream-colored envelope with Julian's name typed on it in a sharp, elegant font. "I'm instructed to wait for a reply," the man said. His voice as flat and emotionless as his expression. Julian took the envelope, his heart starting a slow, heavy beat against his ribs. It felt heavy, expensive. He tore it open. Inside was a thick card with the same elegant typing. It was an invitation. A private meeting, with a name he knew only from headlines, Silas Blackwood. Blackwood was a mystery, a tech billionaire who had vanished from the public eye years ago, a man rumored to be as brilliant as he was reclusive. The invitation was simple. It requested his presence at Blackwood's estate that very evening to discuss a unique professional opportunity. A car would be sent for him. Julian laughed, a dry, rusty sound. A professional opportunity? What could he possibly offer a man like Silas Blackwood? Piano lessons for his equally reclusive children? It had to be a mistake, or a very cruel joke. He looked up at the chauffeur, who stood waiting patiently, as if he had all the time in the world. "I think there's been some kind of error," Julian started to say. "The instructions were quite clear, sir," the chauffeur interrupted, his tone still perfectly neutral. "Mr. Blackwood does not make errors." Something in the man's unwavering certainty stopped Julian. The sheer absurdity of it all was a welcome distraction from the gray fog of his daily life. What did he have to lose? An evening of staring at his dusty piano and his unpaid bills? A flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a spark of curiosity, maybe even a tiny, reckless hope ignited within him. "All right," he heard himself say. "I'll be ready." An hour later, Julian was sliding into the back of a silent, black sedan that smelled of new leather and money. The city lights blurred past his window as they drove further and further from the cramped streets he knew, out into the rolling hills where the mega-rich built their fortresses. He felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. He was a ghost from his own past, being summoned to a world he thought had forgotten him. The car passed through towering iron gates that swung open silently and proceeded up a long, winding driveway. The mansion that loomed at the end wasn't a warm, welcoming home. It was a structure of sharp angles, dark glass, and cold concrete, looking more like a modern art museum than a place where people lived. The chauffeur opened his door and led him not into a grand foyer, but down a long, sterile hallway and into a vast, empty ballroom. The room was so large his footsteps echoed. The only piece of furniture was a single, grand piano sitting in the center of a pool of light, looking lonely and exposed, and there, standing by the far wall, was a man. He was older than Julian expected, with silver hair and a face that was a mask of calm intelligence. This was Silas Blackwood. He didn't smile or offer a handshake. He just watched Julian approach with an unnerving, piercing gaze. "Thank you for coming," Blackwood said, his voice quiet but carrying easily in the enormous room. He gestured towards the piano. "I have a proposition for you. A simple one." Julian stood beside the piano, his heart thudding now like a trapped bird against his ribs. He could feel the familiar, dreaded tension beginning to build in his right hand. "I want you to play that piano," Blackwood said, his eyes never leaving Julian's. "Play one song. Any song you choose. It doesn't matter how well you play it. It doesn't matter if you miss notes. All that matters is that you begin, and you do not stop until the song is over." He paused, letting the strange words hang in the air between them. Julian was completely confused. What kind of game was this? "If you do this," Blackwood continued, his tone as calm as if he were discussing the weather, "I will have $10 million transferred to your bank account before sunrise." Julian felt the air leave his lungs. $10 million. The number was so absurd, so unreal, it didn't even compute. It was enough to wipe out every debt, to buy a new life, to simply disappear. It was a lifeline thrown from a ship he didn't understand. He looked from Blackwood's impassive face to the gleaming black and white keys of the piano. His hand twitched at his side, a painful reminder of his brokenness. It was impossible. It had to be a trick? But as he stood there in the cold, silent room, with the weight of his entire ruined life pressing down on him, he knew he had no choice but to play the game. He had to know. The $10 million echoed in Julian's head, a number so big it felt like a fantasy. It was a life raft in a stormy sea, and he was drowning. He looked from the cold, calm face of Silas Blackwood to the piano sitting alone in the pool of light. His right hand, the traitor, began its familiar, subtle tightening, a painful reminder of his broken reality. It was impossible. It had to be a cruel, elaborate joke. But what choice did he have? He was already living a joke, a bad one with no punchline. He might as well play along, with a deep breath that felt more like a surrender than a preparation. Julian walked towards the piano. Each step on the polished marble floor was loud in the vast, empty space, the sound bouncing back at him. He felt like a man walking to his own execution, or perhaps his salvation. As he got closer, he could see the piano was not just any instrument. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, the kind of thing he'd only read about in magazines for wealthy musicians. The wood was a deep, swirling ebony, polished so perfectly it reflected the single spotlight above like a dark, still lake. The ivory keys looked pristine, untouched, as if they had been waiting just for him. He reached out and let his fingers hover over the keys, not quite touching them. He could feel a coolness radiating from them. For a moment, a flicker of the old joy returned. This was his world. These 88 keys were once his kingdom. He could close his eyes and still see the layout, feel the weight of each key under his fingers. But the memory was a bittersweet poison. He remembered the power he once held. The ability to make a room full of people weep or cheer with just a touch. Now, his own hand wouldn't even let him play a simple scale without a stutter. He sat down on the polished black bench. It was hard and cold, unforgiving. He flexed his fingers, trying to loosen the tension in his right hand, but it was no use. The muscles were knotted, a rebellion brewing under his skin. He had to choose a song. What do you play for a madman with $10 million to burn? He thought of something simple, something he could maybe fake his way through. But a different, more defiant thought pushed its way to the surface. Why play it safe? This whole situation was insane. Maybe insanity was what was required. He decided on the most difficult piece he had ever mastered, a Chopin etude known for its lightning-fast runs and its demanding, powerful chords. It was a piece that required a perfect, flawless technique, a piece his damaged hand couldn't even begin to attempt. It was an act of pure, reckless defiance. If he was going to fail, he would fail trying to reach the heavens, not crawling on the ground. He closed his eyes, and for a second, he could hear it perfectly in his mind, the cascading notes, the thunderous melody, the raw, passionate emotion of it. It was the music of the man he used to be. He opened his eyes, placed his left hand on the keys, and then, hesitantly, his right. His fingers felt clumsy, foreign. He took one last, shaky breath and pressed down on the first chord. He expected a wave of sound to fill the massive room, a powerful chord that would shake the dust from the rafters. But there was nothing. Only a dull, soft thump. It was the sound of felt hitting wood, a muffled, pathetic sound like a heartbeat underwater. He froze. He looked down at his hands. They were in the right position. He had pressed the keys correctly. He could feel the mechanism moving inside the piano, the hammers striking the strings. He had felt the vibration through his fingertips. Confused, he tried again. He pressed another key, this time harder, putting all his frustration into it. Again, the same ghostly thud. He tried a few more keys, a silent, discordant jumble. Panic began to creep in, cold and sharp. Was it him? Was something wrong with his ears? He lifted his hands to his ears, cupping them. He could hear his own breathing, loud and ragged. He could hear the frantic thumping of his own heart. So he wasn't deaf? The piano was silent. His head snapped up to look at Blackwood. The man hadn't moved. He was still standing by the wall, a dark silhouette against the dim light, his face unreadable. He was just watching. This sent a fresh wave of fear through Julian. This wasn't a joke. A joke had a punchline, a moment of revelation. This was something else. This was a test, but the rules were a complete mystery. He stood up from the bench, his anger overriding his fear. "What is this?" he shouted, his voice sounding small and lost in the enormous room. "What kind of game are you playing?" Blackwood said nothing. He just watched Dot, and then Julian noticed something else. The room had been quiet before, but now it was different. It was a deeper, more profound silence. He strained his ears, trying to catch any sound at all. He realized the low, almost unnoticeable hum of the mansion's air conditioning. A sound he hadn't even been aware of until it was gone had vanished. The silence was pressing in on him, thick and heavy, like a physical weight. Just as this thought solidified in his mind, another sound disappeared. From somewhere down the hall, he had been able to faintly hear the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock. A steady, reassuring beat of time passing. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Now it was gone. The silence was absolute. It was so complete that it felt like it was sucking the air out of the room. He could hear the blood rushing in his own ears. He was trapped. He was in a void, a pocket of nothingness, with a silent instrument and a silent observer. The $10 million felt like a distant dream from another world. The task of playing a song now seemed like an impossible form of torture. He looked at the perfect, beautiful piano, and it no longer looked like an old friend. It looked like a monster, a beautiful, silent monster, and he was its prisoner. The hope he had felt just moments ago had curdled into a cold, hard dread. Everything had gone silent, and in that silence he had never felt more alone. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders, filling his lungs until he could barely breathe. His shout, "What is this?" died in the air, swallowed by the nothingness. He felt like a fool, a puppet in a show he didn't understand. His anger, hot and sharp, flared up again, a desperate fire in the suffocating dark. He turned away from the silent piano and stormed towards the large double doors he had entered through. He would leave? He would walk out of this madhouse and back to his small, sad life, because at least there, the silence wasn't a weapon. He grabbed the ornate brass handles and pulled with all his might. They didn't budge? Not an inch. He pushed, then pulled again, his knuckles turning white. He threw his shoulder against the heavy wood, the impact sending a dull thud through his body, a sound that was immediately absorbed by the room. He was trapped. A caged animal. He spun around, his back against the unyielding door, and glared at the man standing by the wall. Blackwood hadn't moved a muscle. He was just watching, his face a calm, blank canvas, which somehow felt more infuriating than any expression of mockery could have. The fight drained out of him as quickly as it had come. The anger was a firework, bright and loud for a moment, but now all that was left was a hollow ache and the smell of smoke. He slid down the door, his body feeling heavy and useless, until he was sitting on the cold marble floor. He put his head in his hands, the rough fabric of his sleeves scratching against his face. He was done. He couldn't fight the silence, he couldn't fight the door, and he couldn't fight the man who had put him here. He was just a broken musician in a silent room, and the $10 million felt like a joke from a childhood dream. He sat there for a long time. Or maybe it was only a few minutes. Time had lost its rhythm without the tick of a clock. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was a canvas, and in his desperation, his mind started to paint on it. At first, it was just noise, the chaotic static of his own thoughts, his debt, his shame, the memory of the boy banging on the keyboard. But slowly, as the exhaustion settled in, the static began to quiet down. And then, he heard it dot. It wasn't a sound that his ears could perceive. It was a sound inside his head. It was a single, clear note. A C, then another. An E, then a G, a simple, perfect chord. It was the Chopin. The music he had tried to play was still there, not in the strings of the silent piano, but in the vast, silent concert hall of his own memory. In the absence of any other noise, the music in his mind became more vivid, more real than it had been in years. He could hear the full richness of it, the swell of the imaginary orchestra, the subtle grace notes he used to be able to execute without thinking. He lifted his head from his hands. His heart no longer pounding with panic, but with a slow, steady rhythm of wonder. He looked at his right hand, resting limply on his knee. He saw the slight, involuntary curl of his fingers, the physical proof of his failure. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a curse. It just felt like a thing that was. The music wasn't in his fingers. It had never been. The fingers were just messengers. The music was somewhere deeper. Blackwood's words came back to him, not as a sound, but as a thought. The contract was to play. It had never been about the sound. It had never been about the $10 million. It was a test, but not the one he thought he was failing. The test wasn't, can you make this piano produce music? The test was, are you still a musician when the music is taken away? A strange sense of calm washed over him. The despair, the anger, the fear it all receded like a tide, leaving behind something solid and uncheckable. He was a musician. Even when he couldn't play, he taught. Even when his hand betrayed him, he heard symphonies in his head. The dystonia could break his fingers, but it couldn't break the part of him that was made of melody and harmony. Slowly, he pushed himself up from the floor. He stood for a moment, just breathing, feeling the solid ground beneath his feet. He walked back to the piano. This time, his steps were not heavy with dread or defiance. They were light, purposeful. He felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He was no longer a victim. He was a volunteer. He sat down on the hard bench. He looked at the keys, no longer seeing them as a monument to his failure, but as a tool. A way to connect the music inside him to the physical world, even if no one else could hear it. He placed his left hand on the keys and then his right. He didn't fight the tension in his fingers. He acknowledged it, accepted it, and then let it go. It didn't matter anymore. He closed his eyes, he began to play, he pressed down on the keys, feeling the familiar, silent thud under his fingers. but in his mind, a thunderous chord filled the ballroom. He felt the music flow from him, not through his ears, but through his entire being. His fingers, though flawed, moved with a new kind of grace. They weren't trying to be perfect. They were trying to be true. He poured everything into that silent performance. He poured in the memory of his first standing ovation, the sting of his first bad review, the joy of creating a perfect phrase, and the soul-crushing pain of losing it all. He played for the little boy who didn't care, for the landlord who wanted his rent, for the doctors who had no answers. But mostly, he played for himself, for the young man who fell in love with the piano, and for the broken man who had forgotten how he was lost in the music in a world of pure emotion. The silent room fell away completely. He was no longer in a mansion on a hill. He was everywhere the music had ever taken him. He felt the tears stream down his face, but he didn't wipe them away. They were part of the performance. As he reached the final imaginary passage of the piece, his fingers flew across the keys, a silent storm of motion and intent. He played the last, phantom chord, his hands hovering over the keys as the final note faded into the infinite silence of his mind. He held the pose, his body trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was exhausted, emptied out, but he felt more alive than he had in a decade. He slowly opened his eyes and looked up, across the vast, quiet room, directly at the man who had brought him here. The silence was no longer a prison. It was a shared space. And in that silence he knew he had won. He held the final, silent chord, his body trembling with a force that had nothing to do with physical exertion. It was the release of a decade of pain, a dam breaking inside him, letting a flood of raw emotion pour out into the silent room. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, and he felt the dampness of tears on his cheeks, but he didn't care. He was empty, but it was a good kind of empty, the feeling you get after a long fever finally breaks. He slowly lifted his hands from the keys, the muscles in his arms aching. He had poured his entire soul into that performance, a performance for an audience of one, himself. And as he sat there, in the aftermath of his personal storm, he looked up at the man who had put him through this ordeal, ready for whatever came next. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. It was no longer a prison, but a sacred space, a chapel for the music that had just been offered up. Julian expected Blackwood to speak, to move, to do something to break the spell. But the man remained still, a dark statue against the distant wall. Just when Julian thought the silence would go on forever, a new sound entered the room. It was a single, soft clap. It wasn't loud. In a normal room, it would have been barely noticeable. But here, in this pocket of absolute nothingness, it was like a thunderclap. It was sharp and clear, a clean, percussive sound that shattered the stillness. Julian flinched, his head snapping towards the source of the noise. Blackwood had lowered his hands. He had been the one to clap. And then he did it again. 3 more slow, deliberate claps. It wasn't applause for a show. It was an acknowledgement. A recognition. For the first time, Blackwood moved. He pushed himself off the wall and began to walk slowly towards the piano. With each step, the cold, indifferent mask on his face seemed to melt away, revealing something underneath. It wasn't pity or amusement. It was respect. A deep, profound respect that was more unnerving than any of his previous coldness. He stopped a few feet from the piano, his gaze fixed on Julian. "I have been in this room with 73 musicians," Blackwood said, his voice quiet but impossibly clear in the dead air. "Famous soloists, members of the world's best orchestras, virtuosos who can play anything ever written. They all failed." He paused, his eyes scanning Julian's tear-streaked face. "You are the first one to understand." Julian just stared, confused. "Understand what? That your piano is broken?" A faint smile touched Blackwood's lips. "It's not broken. It's perfect." He gestured around the room. "This entire ballroom is what is known as an anechoic chamber. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they are all covered in special wedges that absorb sound. There is no echo, no reverberation. Sound doesn't bounce. It just dies. As for the piano," he said, patting the glossy black lid, Its soundboard is made of a non-resonant composite material. It's designed to absorb the vibration of the strings, not amplify it. It is, for all intents and purposes, the quietest piano in the world. Julian's mind reeled. It wasn't a trick. It was an experiment. A cruel, bizarre experiment. Why? He finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. Why would you do this? Blackwood walked over to a small panel on the wall that Julian hadn't noticed before. He placed his hand on it, not flipping any switch, just resting it there as if drawing strength from it. Because I was a musician once, he began, his voice softer now, filled with a distant sadness. Not a pianist. A violinist? It was my entire life. From the moment I woke up to the moment I fell asleep, there was music. I could feel the vibration of the strings through my chin, feel the resonance of the wood in my bones. It was my connection to everything. He turned to look at Julian, and for the first time, Julian saw not a billionaire, but a man who had lost something precious. I was in a car accident. A stupid, pointless thing. I wasn't badly hurt, not physically. But the damage was done. The nerve damage in my ears was permanent. The world went silent. One day I could hear the rustle of sheet music, the roar of an audience, the sweet singing voice of my violin. The next day, nothing. He let the silence hang in the air, a shared experience now between the two men. I can remember what music sounds like. I have a perfect library of it in my head. I can hear a Bach concerto or a Vivaldi sonata whenever I want. But I can never hear it again. Not from the outside? I lost my connection to the world of sound. Julian felt a knot tighten in his chest. He understood. He understood perfectly. His own hands had become a prison, separating him from his music. Blackwood's ears had become his. I built this room because I wanted to find someone who understood, Blackwood continued. I wanted to find a musician who knew that music isn't just sound waves hitting an eardrum. It's intention. It's memory. It's the space between the notes. It's the soul you pour into the instrument. All those others, he said with a wave of his hand, they relied on the sound. They would press a key, hear nothing, and panic. They would get angry, frustrated. They were trying to force the music out of the box. They forgot that the real music was already inside them. He looked directly at Julian, his eyes intense. But you were different. You had already lost your connection to the sound in a way. Your hand, your condition, it forced you to live inside the music. When you were faced with a silent instrument, you didn't panic for long. You went inward. You didn't play the piano. You became the music. I could see it in your face and the way your body moved. You weren't just remembering the notes. You were reliving them. You were playing from the very core of your being. He turned back to the panel on the wall. The $10 million is real? It's yours. You earned it the moment you decided to play for yourself and not for me. He flipped a single, large switch. The effect was immediate. A low, gentle hum filled the room, the sound of the building's air conditioning coming back to life. The air itself seemed to change, to feel less heavy, less sterile. Julian could hear a faint ticking from a clock down the hall. The world had returned. He looked down at the piano keys, which now looked different, full of potential. Blackwood walked back to stand beside the piano bench. He looked down at Julian, his expression no longer one of a scientist observing an experiment, but of a fellow musician, a friend. The test was over. The game was won. Now, he said, his voice gentle, inviting, play it for me to hear. The words hung in the air, not as a command, but as an invitation. Play it for me to hear. Julian sat at the piano, his mind a whirlwind. The world of sound had returned, a low hum filling the space where there had been nothing. The $10 million was a reality, a notification he could check on his phone at any moment, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the man standing beside him, a man who had built a silent tomb for music just to find someone who understood its soul. Julian looked down at his hands. They were the same hands that had failed him 1,000 times, the same right hand that had curled into a painful claw just an hour ago. He expected to feel the old familiar dread, the tightening in his chest, the panic of knowing his fingers would betray him. But it wasn't there. The pressure was gone. It wasn't an audition. It wasn't a performance for a crowd of critics. It was a conversation. He looked at Blackwood, who stood with his eyes closed, as if already listening with more than just his ears. He was playing for a kindred spirit. He took a breath, but this one was different. It wasn't shaky or filled with fear. It was deep and calm. He placed his fingers on the keys, the cool ivory of familiar comfort. He started the same Chopin etude he had played in silence. The first note rang out, clear and true, filling the vast ballroom. It was a shock. A beautiful, wonderful shock. The sound didn't just hit his ears. It seemed to vibrate through his entire body, through the bench, through the floor. He could feel Blackwood feel it too, a slight tremor in the old man's stance. He continued to play. And something miraculous happened. His fingers, the ones that had stumbled and faltered for years, moved with a grace he thought was gone forever. It wasn't perfect. There were still missed notes, a slight hesitation in a fast run where his right hand didn't quite keep up. But it didn't matter. The flaws were what made it real. It was the sound of a man who had been broken and was putting himself back together, one note at a time. The music wasn't technically flawless, but it was emotionally perfect. It was filled with the memory of the silent performance, the pain, the desperation, and the final, cathartic release. He was telling a story, the story of his lost years and the story of his rediscovery in a silent room. The piano was no longer a monster or a monument to his failure. It was his voice again, and it had so much to say. As he reached the powerful climax of the piece, the music swelled, filling every corner of the room. He glanced at Blackwood and saw that the man had tears streaming down his face. He wasn't just hearing the music with his damaged ears. He was feeling its vibrations through the solace of his shoes, through the air, seeing the passion in Julian's posture. He was experiencing it in every way he could. The sight of those tears gave Julian a strength he hadn't felt in a decade. He poured everything he had left into the final passages, his fingers flying across the keys, a blur of motion and emotion. He brought the piece to a close, his hands lingering on the keys as the final, powerful chord faded into a gentle, ringing echo. The room fell silent again. But this time it was a warm, living silence, full of the memory of the music. Julian's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer force of what he had just done. He felt completely drained, but also more full than he had ever been. He had played not for money, not for fame, but for the pure, unadulterated joy of it. Blackwood slowly opened his eyes. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked over to the piano and placed a hand gently on the case as if to thank the instrument itself. Then he looked at Julian, and his expression was one of pure gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I haven't felt music like that in a very long time." He pulled a small, sleek phone from his pocket and tapped the screen a few times. "It's done," he said simply. "The $10 million is yours. Use it, don't use it, it makes no difference to me. You already earned your reward." Julian nodded, the money feeling like a distant, irrelevant detail. The real reward was the feeling in his heart, the music still humming in his soul. "But that is not why I brought you here," Blackwood continued, putting his phone away. "That was only the test. This is the offer." He began to walk slowly around the room. "I have spent years building my fortune, but I have also spent years building something else. A foundation. It's a place for musicians like us. Not the superstars, not the prodigies. It's for the ones who have been broken. The violinist who lost an arm, the singer whose vocal cords were damaged, the drummer who developed a tremor. People who had their voice taken from them and were told they could never make music again." He stopped and looked at Julian, his eyes shining with a passionate fire. "I have the buildings, the funding, the best therapists and engineers in the world. But I have been missing the most important thing. A heart. I need someone to run it. Someone who understands that music is more than just perfect notes. Someone who can look at a broken instrument and see a new way to play. Someone who has sat in a silent room and found the music within themselves. I need you. Julian was speechless. He saw his entire life stretching out before him, not as a path of failure, but as a journey that had led him to this exact moment. All the pain, all the despair, it had all been training for this. A year later, Julian stood in a bright, sunny room filled with instruments of all kinds. It was the main hall of the Blackwood Foundation for Musical Arts. He wasn't on a concert stage. He was in a small, cozy corner, sitting with a young girl who had a prosthetic arm. She wanted to be a drummer, but she was frustrated, convinced she could never keep a steady beat. Julian smiled at her. "Forget the sticks for a minute," he said in a gentle voice. "Just close your eyes. Can you feel it? The rhythm is already inside you. It's your heartbeat. Tap your foot. There it is. Now tap your other foot. Now nod your head. You're already playing the drum kit inside you. The drums are just a way to let that rhythm out." He watched as the girl closed her eyes, a small frown of concentration on her face, and began to tap her foot. A slow, hesitant smile spread across her lips. Julian smiled too. He had not regained his old life, but he had found a new one, a more meaningful one. He was no longer just a pianist. He was a keeper of the music, a guide for those who had lost their way. And in that he had found a symphony more beautiful than anything he had ever played before.